Hello, huddlers. Today we have the unique privilege of diving deep into one of the most pressing and complex issues of our time with none other than Dan Ariely, a world-renowned behavioral economist, the James B. Duke Professor of Psychology and Behavioral Economics at Duke University, go Blue Devils, and the best-selling author of Predictably Irrational, The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, and now Misbelief. In Misbelief, Professor Ariely explores how deeply ingrained and often irrational beliefs are formed, how they can spiral into dangerous misbeliefs, and the profound impact they can have on individuals and society. For us as B2B marketers, understanding the psychological mechanisms behind belief and misbelief is crucial. With institutional trust eroding, and you can just, check any number of studies on that, misinformation spreading like wildfire, the ability to engender trust with our audience is more important than ever. But it's also really damn hard. So today we'll explore the causes and consequences of misbelief and how you can address this within your organizations and your personal lives. We'll also discuss strategies for managing misbelief among our teams, the role of stress in exacerbating these tendencies, and how we as marketers can play a pivotal role in rebuilding trust in this skeptical age. Wow. Okay, that's a big promise. Please join me in welcoming Professor Dan Ariely. Big round of applause.
Thank you so much.
Hello from Tel Aviv. So, your interest in misbelief did not start as a typical academic exercise. You became a victim of misinformation. I think it's important to start there because that really sets up the topic of how you got into it.
Yeah, so I've been studying irrationality for a long time. And all my other books started as research projects. And then at some point I said, maybe it's time to write up this research in a more general way. This book, very, very different. And it was actually a terrible period. So think back to early COVID, and I felt I was the most useful I've ever been. This was COVID, biological problem in general, but created lots of social science issues. How do we think about remote work? How do we think about remote education? How do we think about these new habits? What do we do with releasing prisoners? What do we do with people on furlough? What do we do with domestic violence was on the rise? Lots and lots of questions. And I was just working on these questions, and I got calls from companies and governments, and I just felt I was doing what I was supposed to be doing. I felt at the height of being the most useful citizen I could. And then one day, I get an email from a woman I once met and helped. And she said, Dan, what happened to you? How did you become that person? And without thinking too much, I said, what happened to me and what kind of person? And she sends back an email with a long list of links. And I'll just describe one of them. In one of those links, there were pictures of how I was badly injured. True. The video indicated that I was in hospital for 3 years, also true. But then the video went on to say that because of that, I started hating healthy people. And that's the reason I joined Gates, the Cabal, the Illuminati, to try and kill as many people as possible. Not true, by the way. There were videos of people burning my books. There were all kinds of other things. People like, there was one video of two women like sitting in like a living room setting and discussing my my shortcomings as a human being. It was unbelievable, and I tried to argue with them. My first instinct was, if they only talk to me, they would clearly see that I'm a wonderful human being who is just trying to do good. So I tried to talk to them, and every conversation just got things to be worse. They weren't listening. I couldn't convince anybody. They just became more convinced I was evil. And things deteriorated. I started getting death threats. The number of people who bombarded me increased. By the way, we're many years after that now. It hasn't stopped. It hasn't stopped. The last death threat I got was to Duke for the university maybe a few months ago. So it's slowing down, but it hasn't stopped. Anyway, after a month of trying to argue with them, very unsuccessfully, I decided to take a step back. You know, there's something incredibly eerie. I mean, we all have people in our friends or family or close circle that we say, how do those people look at the world that we look at and come up with such different conclusions? But when you're facing somebody, and it's not about Fauci or the flat earth or something, or Trump or whatever, when somebody tells you, I know something about you, and you say, no, it's not true, and they say it is true, it's a very eerie experience. So I felt the need to try and understand this. And I spent the next 2 years trying to understand this process that takes kind, wonderful, smart, generous people and slowly changes them to become misbelievers. And what I mean by misbelievers are people that are believing in something that is not true. That's the first component. But the second component is that this belief is so strong that they adopt it as a lens from which they view other things in life. And so it's not just say, oh, you know, maybe the earth is not round. It's about adopting that and adopting it so full-heartedly that from that perspective you look at everything else. And I describe this mechanism, and you know, it's kind of like a cookie. You know, the cookie in many ways is a weaponized food. Somebody has designed the cookie to have the ultimate mix of sugar, fat, and salt to get us to want one and another one and another one. In many ways, this information cascade, this funnel of misbelief, is attacking all of our psychology. You know, you can really read this book as almost an introduction to psychology textbook, because this machinery attacks our emotional system and our cognitive system and our personality system and our social system. It really attacks lots of us and gets us to believe things that are not good for us, not good for society, sometimes good for social media, but that's about it. And then, as you said correctly in the introduction, and the big envelope for all of this is trust. Because as people go down the funnel of misbelief, they lose trust in society. So you've probably seen statistics on how the reduction of standard vaccines is going down. The reduction of trust in medicine is going down. The reduction of trust in government, I mean, and so on. So certainly the big picture is, yes, individuals are going down this funnel of misbelief, but the loss of trust is a tremendously painful outcome of this for society.
So first, it must have been, I mean, just the whole scenario sounds so awful. And I feel like, oh my gosh, that the burden on and the sense of just helplessness, right? You're getting attacked, and no matter what you do and push back, and a you know, a tremendous empathy. And I think I can imagine all the listeners to this would be going, oh my God, I hope that doesn't happen to me. But I
also hope it doesn't happen to anybody else. It is very, very tough. There's a concept in behavioral economics called scarcity mindset. And scarcity mindset is usually thought about what happened to people in poverty, where part of their mind is constantly busy with poverty. Will I be able to pay for this lunch? Will I be able to take the bus? Will I be able to pay my bills? And you can actually measure a reduction in IQ when poverty increases. Not reduction in IQ, reduction in performance on IQ tests.
Right.
That come because part of their brains are preoccupied with those tasks. I felt the same way. It was incredible. I felt I was thinking at a lower capacity. There was something like, you know, you say, okay, here's a ping. on this. Is there another death threat? Is there something else? You know, they're saying that they're coming to demonstrate outside of my house. Will they really come, or are they just saying it? You know, there's something about it is constantly going, and it was terrifying. As a social scientist, I would say it was incredibly useful. You know, like to actually experience scarcity mindset in that way was actually eye-opening as a social scientist. I mean, not that it was worth the cost, but it was. So I learned lots of things
So
about this, but the journey was painful.
this is your Madame Curie moment where you're testing yourself with radiation. I mean, that didn't work out so well for her,
Yeah.
or her husband, as I recall. But anyway, yeah, I imagine that by accepting this as this horrible problem and deciding to study it, it was in some ways a thing that you could do to just deal with it.
That's right. So when we'll talk about the mechanism, we'll see that what gets people going is feeling out of control, feeling stressed and out of control. And in many ways, I felt stressed and out of control. And rather than starting believing in not the correct theory about the world, I used research as a tool. But you can think of it as my solution to this problem of feeling stressed and out of control was to try and study and understand what was going on.
So at some point, I want to flip from the problem to, and there is no solution, but it's understanding the problem, I think, helps at least folks sort of start to think about this as a path towards solutions. But let's talk a little bit without going to this. You talk about it as a funnel.
Yeah.
And you start here and then you sort of down, and now you're, at the bottom of the rabbit hole. It's like your worldview is completely changed. And we know folks that this has happened to, and we all tend to, okay, they're over there and but talk a little bit about that and in some of your conversations with some of these, we'll call them misbelievers.
So in a very quick way, the breeding ground for misbeliefs is stress. And it's not the stress of the type, gee, I'm so busy, I'm not sure how I'll finish answering all my email. It's stress of the sort, I don't understand this world. What's happening with China and what's happening with illness and unemployment. And basically, I don't understand the world. I don't know what will happen. Why are the Houthis all of a sudden bombing ships in the Red Sea? What is happening with AI? Will I still have my job in 2 years? And when we are experiencing stress, we are designed to look for answers. It's a way to feel that we're in control. And that's the starting point. So it's stress, looking for stories, and then it attacks our cognitive system, our personality system, and our social system, which we can elaborate, but it attacks our cognitive system, the way we look at information, our personality system. Some people are more likely and less likely to become misbelievers, and it attacks our social system. We feel rejected by society, we feel the need to find close others, we feel the need to express our individuality and connect, and it gets worse and worse from there.
It's interesting. I remember one of the women that you reached out to, I think it was the one who had actually introduced you to the problem, had sort of the stress of her thing. She had lost her job. She had sort of lost control, if you will, over her life. So and so, as you said, looking for answers. It's a horrible thing when it happens. And I guess I want to sort of get to, let's say, are there any warning signs? Let's say you're managing a team of people. Are there any warning signs that you might have someone in your team that is sort of going off into misbelief territory?
Yeah, so it's very good that you're thinking about teams and managing, because generally the antidote to stress is resilience. If you think about it, there's a question of how much stress could we take and not get sucked into the need to find alternative explanations. And the thing that helps us is resilience. Now, what is resilience? Usually, we think about two phases of resilience. So imagine life is going on, slightly better, slightly worse, slightly better, slightly worse, goes on along it says. All of a sudden, something really bad happens. In my case, an injury. And we usually think about resilience is, do people bounce back above where they were, below where they were, how long it takes them to bounce back? That's usually resilience. But resilience is also during the path when nothing bad happens. It's about the feeling of resilience. And the best example for this is what is called secure attachment. So imagine that you're a parent to a 4-year-old kid, and you take them to the park, and you say, hey kid, go to the swings. And the kid goes to the swings and come back an hour later. If that happened, you have a kid with secure attachment. Great job. On the other hand, if the kid goes to the swings, but looks behind her shoulder every 90 seconds to see if you're still there, not so successful in secure attachment. Now, if you think about that, secure attachment is all about having like an insurance policy for everything. Saying, I know that if I'll fall, somebody will be here to catch me. Think about what the feeling this is in the world, to say, I can try, I can be brave, I can take risk, I can do all kinds of things because somebody will catch me. And I think that we need we have to realize that we are experiencing a lower level of resilience in society in general. We have less friends in general. We spend less time with friends and more time with our nuclear family. That is a trend over a long period. Many of our friends we don't talk to anymore. We just connect over social media, not really investing in real friendship. And at work, there are many times where work is trying to convince us not to be real friends with people. They say, don't talk about anything personal, certainly not anything that could be thought of as romantic. Don't talk about politics. So we end up having work friends, but not real friends. And then finally, also economic inequality contributes to lower resilience. Why? Because as economic inequality increases, people are less likely to feel comfortable asking for help. Okay, so we're at a high stress, low resilience. So if you ask me, what do managers need to do? I think first of all that managers need to assess the level of resilience in their part of the organization, right? Are people willing to go on a limb? Are people willing to try new things? And by the way, it's not just good for people's mental health, it's also good for productivity, right? If you think about psychological safety, right? Do you feel comfortable saying what's on your mind? If the answer is no, then it's also not a productive team. So the first thing I think that managers need to do is to assess the resilience in their part of the organization. And then when people start having alternative exploration of the world, what they need to do is to make sure that people don't feel rejected and don't feel that they can't share things with the rest of the team. You know, what you don't want to happen is that somebody start believing in something alternative, but they feel uncomfortable sharing with anybody, they feel uncomfortable saying anything, and then you discover it 5 months later when it's already too late. But creating a feeling of psychological safety and sharing and so on is incredibly important. And I use the term funnel because there are times when it's easy to reverse the trend, and there are times when it's very hard. When somebody is moved to the social element, when almost all of their friends now are misbelievers, very hard to change.
Right.
Very, very hard to change.
And we'll get to that. So there was a couple things. One, I just want to put someone will catch me. think, and it's funny because in a team building exercise, there's a classic one, which is where you fall back and
Yeah,
someone actually literally catches you. But that notion of someone catching, we talk about this when we talk about creativity and innovation and how leaders can create safe environments where people can fail and they can also not. Uh,
yeah,
that's sort of, I want to talk about that a little bit. And then, I mean, we talk a lot about it in huddles about that in the building a culture of experimentation and how empowering that is and celebrating successes and failures. We definitely cover that. There was this other thing that I think is so important here is when you ask people why they stay at a company, it's not because necessarily they're the best paid. It's because their friends are there. And so as you describe this, if our bonds between our employees, and we know this from working remotely, the bonds are much harder to form because we're not having
yeah,
coffee together. We're not breaking bread. We're not just hanging out and overhearing each other's personal conversations. So we have to overcompensate
right.
as leaders. So
Can I say something? I don't know
please.
if you know this, but I have for the last 8 years, I've been looking at data from companies, mostly satisfaction surveys, but also data from other sources. And I've been looking at how companies treat employees, how employees feel about the company, and what are the implications for this in the stock market. And I basically asked the question of what are the things that companies treat employees and employees react to that make a difference in the stock market, that we can see alpha. And we even have an ETF. There's even a way now to invest in the companies who treat their employees well. But if you look at what we find that extrinsic motivation almost doesn't matter. Companies that invest in salaries and tables and chairs and coffee and all of those bonuses, all of those things, vacation day, retirement, health benefits, we don't see any return for that in terms of stock market performance. The only thing that we see that makes a difference is the intrinsic motivation. So for example, we find that feeling appreciated is the number one thing in our data that predicts excessive stock market return. Psychological safety contributes connection with the direct manager, connection with the goals of the company. So there's a couple of things that are important, but they're all about the connection the person feels with the company. And when I go and I present this to people on Wall Street, they say, we want hard numbers. And I say, no, you don't. And the reason that you don't want hard numbers is because this is not a phenomena that can be captured by hard numbers. I say, imagine I want to understand how much you love your significant other. I can't look at how many times you send emojis of hearts or what you write to them. I want to capture your love for your significant other. There's no neurological measure, there's no text measure, but what you tell me and how much you love them, or how much you feel pain. There's no neurological way that I can connect to you and find out how much pain you have. The best thing I have is this subjective quality, and reality is that we want a subjective quality. So for example, I said that we find that salary doesn't matter. Perception of fairness of salary matters a lot. But you can't compute perception of fairness of salary with ask people, do you feel that your salary is safe, is fair? It doesn't come from the reality, it's come from the perception. So I think we need to, in that world of investment and evaluating things, I think we need to understand that sometimes we should aim for the subjective. That the subjective is actually what matters. At the end of the day, people are motivated by love and loyalty and friendship and commitment and feeling appreciated and so on. And these are the things that we are inherently subjective, and we should measure them as subjective.
You touched on so many things that feeling appreciated. We talk a lot about that, but aim for the subjective. And now we could just go right into brand because, the fact that you choose one brand over another everybody wants to have a logical thing. Well, it's cheaper, but generally, no, there's other irrational, subjective things. I like this brand better. I
Yeah,
relate to this brand more. And
yeah.
essentially, brand and trust are the same, they're kind of the same
But by the
beast.
way, we can I'll say something about brand, and if you want, we can have a discussion about it another day. I think that brands are a misleading concept because the reality is that brands are actually they bundle together lots of psychology. The brand of Tide is about fluency and familiarity. The brand of Calvin Klein is a very different story. The brand of your car is very different. We use brand to signal to other people. So we call things brand, but when you think about the psychology, it actually collects lots of different psychologies, and sometimes for different product categories. They even, so if you think about, if I told you what cars people are driving, you can say a lot about who they are, right?
Sure.
Not necessarily true about the type of toothpaste that they're using. So
Right.
car is a very much self-signaling mechanism and signaling mechanism. So anyway, so
Got it.
brand, I think it's useful to realize that brand is like a collective measure, but we need to treat it a bit more carefully and think about the different elements in it.
So let's go back to this notion of aiming for the subjective and trying to measure the subjective. We're back to this notion of I want to build a safe environment where someone will catch me, where there's safety at the company and that I feel appreciated. These are all things, but
Yeah.
you said they're hard to measure or they're
They're
complicated to measure.
subjective. They're not hard, they're subjective. Yeah.
So what if you're a leader of a marketing team of 50 that's helping influence a company of 1,000, how do you sort of get at this? Because what we're really talking about here is culture,
Yeah, exactly.
right? And we can talk about it on a team level and we can talk about it on a company level. But what we're trying to do is if we don't want to have misbelief, we want to have belief. And we need to be able to somehow or other engender belief, and we need to be able to somehow or other know we are achieving it or not.
Yeah.
But yet it's still this subjective thing. I feel safe here.
That's right. So first of all, I think we should acknowledge how difficult it is for companies to study anything about human capital. And the reason is that we have lawyers and we have laws. If you wanted to take your organization and treat half of them one way and half of them another way, you couldn't do it. Nobody would let you do it, even if legally, probably. So the reason I like our research is we look at about 1,000 companies. Different companies are doing different things. We can draw conclusions. But companies can do a lot of experiments with their customers. And companies do sometimes experiment with their customers. But experiments internally on employees are very worthwhile, but very hard to do. So most companies don't do it. So I think companies need to look at kind of the data that we have and basically say, okay, let's act based on this data. It's average, it's about the average company, it's not about us, but still it's very useful. And in general, I break the mechanism of intrinsic motivation into two. One is I call goodwill. Imagine that I ask you to call your current level of effort at work 100. And then we go and we say, how much less you can work? Currently you're at 100. How much less you could work and still not get fired? Don't say it out loud, just think about what that number. And then I say, and how much harder could you work above 100 if you're truly enthusiastic about what you're doing? Now that gap between the minimum you have to do not to lose your job and the most you could do if you're truly excited, that's goodwill. That's an amount of effort that is under the decision of the individual. I can sit on my laptop for the hours that you dictate, but how motivated I am, it's internal to me. So we have to ask ourselves, where are people on that range? How excited are they? And of course, autonomy contributes and feeling appreciated, lots of things like that. But that I think is the first question that managers should ask themselves. How much are people truly working at the level that they would if they were truly excited versus trying to just not do the minimum possible not to get fired?
Right.
The second component I call utility embracing. Not a great name, but here's the idea. Imagine we have a janitor in hospital, and just that janitor has a job description. Water, soap, paper, all kinds of things like that. One day, our janitor hears a patient crying, alone in a room. Should the janitor approach that person and ask them if they want them to call somebody? The answer is, of course, yes. One day, our janitor meets a family lost in the corridors. Should the janitor drops what they're doing, walk them to where they need to go? Of course, the answer is yes. When you think about it, lots of people have job descriptions, but we actually want people quite frequently to violate their job description and to do something else. And I call this utility embracing because this is my job description. But you want people to look up, broaden their scope and say, where can I be the most useful? Right now, is it about mentoring somebody? Is it about joining a different project? You know, that janitor in our story actually created more work for themselves. They have to go back later and do all this extra work they didn't do because they did something else. But that's what we want, right? So I think this, for me, this breaking into these two components is very interesting. It's like where people are on the goodwill and how much they're looking at the goodness of the company and how much are they thinking broadly about what is the mission of the company versus just trying to do their job description. So I would try to measure those two and see where you fall. And if you're not falling in a good place, think about what are the steps you could do to improve it.
It's interesting. I interviewed Liz Weissman, who wrote this book, Impact Players, and it's very all about utility embracing because now you can't have everybody in the organization doing that because sometimes it will fall apart, but you need impact players and you need a culture where people realize they are attached to a bigger purpose.
Yeah.
I want to get back before, and this is fascinating, and I know we could go on and on and on. So there's someone on your team or your family, and you see them going down the rabbit hole, but they're not, let's assume they haven't gone so far as the point of no return, where there's kind of no hope. And I'll just tell you a quick story. I was at the dentist at the beginning of COVID, and the woman, the hygienist who was about to clean my teeth, was laughing at me. I said, "Why are you laughing?" She said, "Well, you had 2 masks on coming in, and like you don't even need the masks at all." I said, "What are you talking about?" She says, "Well, I've done my own research, and I've even told my parents don't wear masks." And I immediately stopped and said, "You know what? I'm uncomfortable as a medical professional in theory having you clean my teeth if you don't believe that masks are going to help." So we stopped right there. That person was on the beginning, if not already down the, oh my gosh, rabbit hole. So I've seen that happen. My reaction was, go away. I don't want you in my life. That's a problem. I know that's not a good solution. And what do you do?
So first of all, I think we have to fight this very, very clear urge to say, go away. I used to have the phrase, what color is the sky in your world? And I thought it was slightly funny, and I'm sure that the people who heard me say it about them thought it was hugely offensive. I'm not faulting you, but you probably pushed that woman even further away.
Yeah, I'm sure it did.
She felt rejected, right? And the reality is that we do reject people. Think about in the US currently, somebody is telling you they're pro-life or pro-choice, and you don't believe and you have a different opinion. It's very hard not to think of them as broken. The same thing is happening for people who have different political opinion. In COVID, it was extra painful because if I think that this is a dangerous thing and you're risking my life. And not only that, I'm using precautions at cost to myself, you're taking advantage of the system. And so the tendency to ostracize people is very understandable and very damaging. Actually, the research on ostracism is fascinating, but it shows that when people feel ostracized, everything good about humanity goes away. So the experiments, they get one person to come to outside of a lab. They meet two other people. They think they're also participants, and they play soccer for 10 minutes. Or the same thing, they play soccer for 5 minutes, and then for the next 5 minutes, only the two research assistants toss the ball between them. The participant is like standing there, nobody's passing the ball to them. And then they open the door and they go in and they get tested, and everything good about human being goes down and everything bad goes up. They're less optimistic and less helpful, and they cheat more and they donate less. Really changes us dramatically. And again, very understandable, but very counterproductive. So when you see somebody who's starting their path, don't say what's the color of the sky in your world, but instead try to realize that the social element is very important. If you chase them away from your society, you're going to force them to find a society of people who believe exactly like them, and then things are going to get really bad. So, stop talking to them about that. If it's too hard, stop talking about it. But make them feel loved, supported, valued as a human being. Talk about other topics. Now, hopefully over time, you can maybe also talk about the topics that separate you, but don't make that the main issue. Instead, think about how you give them some resilience, some feeling of social support.
You got to be the bigger person.
Yes, tough role.
It is. I mean, it's hard, and I think that in our political environment, it's even harder. That's like you're red or blue, and if you're, and I mean, it's like Hatfield and McCoy's. I mean, it's really and it's obviously it's gotten worse, not better. In the Edelman Trust Survey, they talked about it seemed like businesses could play a role. Since government trust is at an all-time low, businesses could play a role. And I'm wondering, in your mind, can businesses play a role? Now we're going back from the individual to what a company and what a marketer can do to sort of, I guess, if the institutions are more trustworthy, gradually maybe the trust levels go up, rising tide lifts all ships. Is that a hope? Am I making this up?
So first of all, I think that companies basically don't want to encourage political discussions, right? Because who wants the noise? Right. But by doing so, they're eliminating huge opportunities. What we really want in society is we want people to meet people that they deeply respect but have different opinion than theirs. Right? So I actually want people at the workplace to basically say, talk about your beliefs. I want people to have experience, people that they deeply appreciate but deeply disagree with. That's what we want. Where else would they meet those people if not at work? A family dinner? Less likely, right? So now each company could say, oh, but it also creates some friction. Yes, it's true, but for society it's important. Now, in terms of the other part of your question is, I think we have gone through some interesting trust changes where people have turned to the internet a lot because of lack of trust. You say, who do you trust to recommend a book or a restaurant? It used to be the book reviews. It used to be the restaurant review, the technology review. Right now, you say, I go to my friends. Now, my friends are lovely people, but they know nothing. Like, why would you want to go to your friends? It's because there's a higher level of trust. So I think you're absolutely right. There's a vacuum of trust. And the question is, who would fill that vacuum? Now, not every company can do it as easily, but I think it's a tremendous opportunity. It's a tremendous opportunity. Now, do rising tide lift all ships? If companies were worthy of higher trust and people had higher trust, would people also have higher trust for other things or not? I'm not sure. I don't know kind of what are the implications for kind of the bigger waves, but I do think that for companies, the opportunities for trust are tremendous. And in a world that there's no trust, it's relatively easy to get some. And trust has lots of dividends. If you bought a product, it doesn't work as you expected from a company you have high trust in, very different sense of stress, very different sense of worry, very different sense of what do you make out of this. So trust has lots of value.
I think it's so interesting because we're trying to create bridges from, to employees and individuals or family members where there's been a divide on beliefs, if you will, and, different color skies and so forth. But the path to getting sort of reconnecting is to be able to agree to disagree, to understand how to manage conflict, to be able to talk about, have different points of view and not it come back to, you're wrong, I can't talk to you. And I'm wondering, because that's so interesting, because, a lot of leaders want to have harmony in their groups. And to some extent, you need conflict because you need people to argue from different perspectives. And eventually they have to, get to consensus, and we all have to learn how to do that. So I'm curious, in your experience or from the research that you've done, how can you sort of bring conflict into the workplace while you're still creating this sort of environment of trust, right? I mean, they feel like, and safety.
So one of my favorite strategies, so we said the stress, cognition, personality, and social. And we touched on stress a little bit. On the social, we talked about rejection, ostracism. There's more elements, of course. But one of my favorite strategies in the cognitive component, and it's based on what is called the illusion of explanatory depth. So imagine the following exercise. Imagine we get a group of 1,000 people, and we say to these 1,000 people, think about all the debates you had in the last 3 years. You had one opinion, the other person had another opinion. You talked for about half the time. They talked for about half the time. From all of the cases that you had such a debate on anything meaningful and important, how many of these debates ended with the person on the other side saying, you know what, you're absolutely correct. I never thought about things this way. Your arguments are so thoughtful and clear. I'm changing my opinion. Most people said, never happened to me. And then you said, and how many times has the opposite happened? When you talk to somebody for an hour, and at the end of the hour, you told them, oh, you know what, you're absolutely correct. I never thought about it this way and so on, but you're absolutely right. And people say, almost never. Now, why does it happen? It happens because when we talk, and when we don't talk, we don't listen. We counter-argue. So we made an argument, the other side makes an argument, we don't let them even finish the first sentence, we already counter-argue in our mind what they're going to say, and we're coming up with the other argument. So we end up not listening, we end up either talking out loud or talking inside our voice. The illusion of explanatory depth says the following. It says people's confidence in their knowledge is dramatically disproportionate to their knowledge, dramatically over the real knowledge. And the path for discussion starts with reducing confidence, not changing knowledge. I demonstrated this with a flush toilet. I went to people and I said, do you understand how a flush toilet works? I said, yes. I said, on a scale from 1 to 7, almost 7. Great. Now, I didn't argue with them. I just said, luckily for you, I have all the pieces here of a brand new flush toilet. Please assemble it. Nobody could assemble it. And then I say, so how well do you understand flush toilet? And people said, not so much. Now think about it. I didn't attack. I say, help me understand how a flush toilet works. And it turns out it works for everything. You ask people, what is your opinion? I'm not arguing. Help me understand how this works. So, for example, we did this with some people who thought that the previous elections were stolen. We didn't argue. We say, help us understand how are elections being tallied? How do the votes get counted? And people say, I don't know. We say, okay, and how would somebody be able to steal the election? I also don't know. So now, when we puncture people's confidence, do we change them from being pro-X to anti-X? Of course not. But do we basically change them from being 100% sure that what they're saying is correct to being 95% sure? That we can do. And that's a great starting point, because if somebody is less sure and say, you know what, I still think it's more likely that the elections were stolen, but I also think that it might not. Now we're starting to get and look at information in a very different way. So an important thing to do is to basically be aware of what we actually know and don't know, is to talk about the assumption, to talk about the mechanism, to basically, the term that people use, which I don't like, it's called intellectual humility. Let's just agree that we don't know that much. I often ask people, do you have clear opinions about global warming? Either this way or that way, I don't care. Do you just have opinion that you think are solid? And people say yes. And then I say, and what have you read? And many people say nothing. And some people say, I read the UN report. And then I said, did you really read the UN report? And they say, not really. I only read the summary. So, there's a lot of things that we think we know, but the moment we agree we don't know, it really opens the conversation in a very good way. So I would do that, with Uncle Joe, and I would do this at work and work. By the way, if I could, intellectual humility would be something I would add in schools. It's tough for us. We want to feel confident. Like, so much of our world is built on, I know the answer. Follow me. But it's so important to basically say, yeah, I'm going to work on this assumption, but I'm going to keep an open mind.
It's amazing. So many different things are coming together as you're talking about this, and how it's a process. We had Christopher Voss, who wrote this book about negotiation, and it's called Never Split the Difference, which is sort of funny in the context of this conversation. But when faced with an irrational demand, like, I need $1 million from you, from a kidnapper, saying that in a day, the question was, well, how am I supposed to do that? And ironically, that the person had to think about it and say, oh, well, how is he supposed to do it? And they hadn't necessarily.
That's right.
So
I think what he said was, how would you do it if you were me?
Yeah.
Right. And but by the way, questions in general are a very good mechanism, because what questions do is they transfer people to a different situation. Right. So imagine, let's take something difficult. But imagine I asked you something about a mother whose child is being held hostage in Gaza. And imagine I said a statement. I said something like, mothers that their kids are hostages in Gaza cannot cannot have a minute in the day when they don't think about their kids. That's a statement. Or I could ask you a question, and I could say, how many minutes do you think a mother whose child is a hostage in Gaza could spend a day not thinking about her kid? Now, what you do when you get the question frame is you transition yourself to that position of that mother. You try to the question transforms you to an empathetic perspective to that mother, and now you're in a different state to think about situation. So in general, I also really like questions rather
Yes.
than statements, because they, put yourself into my situation. Now you're feeling very different, like in the negotiation stuff.
You're bringing me, of course, every conversation always ends up with Ben Franklin, who was a big believer in the Socratic method. He would use that way of persuading. He didn't say young, he would just help them sort of get there through a series of questions. And all of this gets back to, as a leader, being empathetic, asking good questions, as a family member, as a father, someone trying to bridge some gaps here in a very complicated, in truth, the book is really worth just help you understand where this is coming, why it happens, where it's coming from, and you may never get that person to agree with you, but maybe you can get them a little bit back. And there's a famous story about, I'm not sure where this one was, but you read every room in the book, and every book in a room, you open the door and there's a larger room. And it takes sort of intellectual honesty to accept the fact that you don't know as much as you know about anything. And I
Yeah.
think that humility, if leaders have that, that's a good place to start too.
Yeah.
So I could keep going, and I know there's so much to think, but I maybe we could wrap up with, what advice would you give to chief marketing officers who are striving to build resilient, trustworthy brands amidst this sort of growing tide of misbelief? Maybe you frame it in two
Yeah.
do's or a don't, whatever works. Some parting wisdom here.
Yeah. So I think the first thing to recognize is how important trust is. I think we often think about other things, but I think we need to think about how important trust is as a starting point. The second thing is to figure out how do we make trust a long-term strategy. How do you make trust low? And this, of course, can happen to the brand, but it can also happen to your team. When a brand has trust, it can withstand waves in the future, right? Things would happen. And I think there are kind of three levels of trust in general. The first level of trust is what is called transparency. You don't trust me, okay, I'll open the camera so you know exactly where I am. You have a kid, you don't trust the kid, you get to track them on their phone so you know every time. That's not real trust. It's just transparency, so they can't violate your agreement, but it's not trust. The second level of trust is what is called is to show that you care about them. And the example I like about this is that imagine I'm a waiter. You're having dinner with 3 other people. I come to you and I say, "What would you like?" And you say, "I want the fish." And I say, "The fish is not so good today. Take the chicken. It's cheaper and better." And then I measure, do you take my advice? Do other people take my advice? Does the table take my advice? Or I come to you, "What would you like?" "I want the fish." I say, "The fish is not so good today. Take the steak. It's only twice as expensive, but it's amazing." Now, which waiter gets more trust? The waiter who said cheaper and better, or the waiter who said more expensive and better? Of course, the cheaper and better. The waiter basically demonstrated that they care more about you than they care about themselves. Right? So if the first level of trust is transparency, the second is to show that we care. Not just to say that we care, but to show that we care, to do things that are hurting us for the benefit of the customers. You can't always do it, but sometimes you can. And then the third level of trust, the one that is the most desirable, that's what happened in long-term relationships, long-term aligned interests. I'm not here just for today, I'm not here just for this month, I'm here for the long term, right? And that's kind of the thing we want to really aspire to. How do we create the feeling that we're not fly by night, we don't just care about this one sale, We're here for the long term. We care about our long-term aligned interest. It's a mutual benefit that we can both work toward. That's where real trust is created.
I love it. Oh my gosh. Well, Professor Ariely, it's been fantastic talking to you. I so appreciate you spending time with us today, also for the podcast. Uh, I know that you do some outside work besides that. Can companies engage you? And if so, how do they find you?
The best way to find me on my website, www.danariely.com, all kinds of information, and you can also reach me from there.
Awesome. Well, thank you again.